How often should your athlete sprint? It sounds like a super simple question, and most coaches answer it the same way. They fit speed sessions into whatever gaps are left in the weekly schedule. Add a couple of sprint days and hope for the best. But here's the problem with that. Sprint frequency isn't about scheduling. It's about a programming decision, and getting it wrong, either too much or too little, is one of the fastest ways to undo everything you're building in your speed program. But before we get into it, if you haven't grabbed the Field Speed Toolkit yet, do that now. It's free. It includes a plug and play training week, a speed drill audit sheet, and 5 transfer filters that help you make better coaching decisions faster. The link's in the description. Grab it and follow along with the series. Right, so how often should athletes sprint? The answer depends on 4 things, and once you understand all 4, frequency stops being a guess and starts actually being a system. So let's get into it. The first thing most coaches get wrong about sprint frequency is assuming all sprint work costs the same, and that one assumption is responsible for more poorly programmed speed sessions than almost anything else. So here's what I mean. A beginner athlete who's doing fundamental sprint drills, wall drives, marches, build up, basic acceleration. This is the purple line here, and the recovery cost to the nervous system is really low. So the nervous system isn't being pushed anywhere near its limit, and the intensity is manageable. This green line represents our baseline, and at that beginner level we can do sessions at a much higher frequency even every day, and will slowly start to improve because the intensity is really low, because we're not going to be accumulating the kind of fatigue that blunts adaptation. But most coaches treat it like high intensity sprint work and restrict it to 2 sessions a week, leaving massive developmental windows completely unused. But if we look at the other end and we look at a more advanced athlete, so we go from a learning speed age to more of a training to sprint or a competing to sprint age, much higher, where we're using speed to load speed, this advanced athlete at genuine maximum velocity, these curves here represent such a big cost, because one session is going to fatigue that athlete really tremendously, because the dose is going to be so high. Then it's going to take 2 to 3 days to recover from that, to then improve over time, to then be able to reload that session again. So you're going from a beginner having a higher frequency to because the cost of it is low, the intensity is low, and moving to more of a faster advanced athlete based on how much of the athlete's genetic potential has been exposed to the early gains, as we talked about in previous videos. We're then having to open the training up, because the research is really clear that you need at least 72 hours before an athlete is ready for another high quality sprint stimulus. We push them too close and that window closes. You're not actually developing speed, you're just accumulating fatigue on top of fatigue. So before you program a single sprint session, ask one question: where does the athlete sit on the speed age scale? Because that answer tells you exactly how much frequency they can handle and how much they actually need and how much they're trained. So now, once you know the recovery cost, the next decision is how to actually structure your week around it. So here's how most coaches build a training week. We look at the days available and block out the sessions they're comfortable with. So we'll probably start with gym here, maybe a bit of conditioning there. If we're lucky, we could get a technical session in on the Wednesday, and then basically try to fit speed in. I have to have a rest day there, so I'm going to put speed in there, and then maybe another gym session there and a rest session there. That's kind of how the thought process is. But it's really backward, because if speed is the quality you're trying to develop, it needs to be the first thing that goes into the week, not the last. Okay, so let me draw this out for you. Here's a 2-day speed week. Day 1 is going to be acceleration. This is where we're going to be developing force application, shin angles and mechanics of driving. Then day 3 is going to be maximum velocity orientated. This is where we're going to develop stride length, ground contact and top speed expression. 2 completely different qualities, 2 completely different sessions, separated by enough recovery to actually adapt between them. And here's a caveat: the reason why we're going to do acceleration before maximum velocity is that the acceleration is going to be the skill driver towards unlocking more maximum speed later down the line. As we progress through a cycle, they will swap over or merge into 2, but that's for a later video. Okay, then off the back of this, strength and power work gets built in and around these 2 anchors and not the other way around. So we could leave it and just have our gym-based session there on the Friday, so you've got 3 really good quality sessions with a weekend off, big recovery before that speed, which is more than adequate enough. But now if you want to progress to 3 sessions a week, we add a 3rd quality. For field sport athletes, that's change of direction. So 1 day acceleration, okay, day 3 is going to be maximum velocity, then we can sub out the gym here and then we can put our change of direction. And this is what we're periodizing around, known as movement specific speed. Okay, each session targets a specific expression of speed, and that week is structured to develop all 3 without one bleeding into the recovery window of another. Think of it as daily undulating periodization, or conjugating periodization, where we're looking at training different variables or outputs across the week, but actually all these 3 exhibit many similar outputs, but the movement signatures are different. So that's how we're going to be structuring the week. So when you make speed the anchor, you can build everything else around it, because the moment speed becomes the thing that fits around conditioning and gym work, it stops being a priority and your athletes stop getting faster. Because structuring the week is one thing, but the right frequency looks completely different depending on whether you're working with an academy athlete or senior team sport players. So we've got the weekly structure sorted, but here's where coaches make a mistake that doesn't show up immediately. It shows up 2 to 3 years down the line when an athlete who looked promising at 17 is suddenly plateauing at 20 and no one can work out why. The problem is intensity, and specifically when it gets introduced. Academy athletes and senior athletes have completely different relationships with sprint intensity, and treating them the same way is one of the most damaging things you can do to a young athlete's long-term speed development. So here's an intensity adaptation curve for an athlete, and what this demonstrates, that the higher level of progress that we need to make, okay, the more intensity that we're going to need. So with an academy level, the actual ceiling of intensity is really low, versus a more mature seasoned athlete based on a structured training program is going to be really different. So what we need to do is introduce intensity at the right level by measuring improvement over time, and not just going for a young athlete and sticking them right up at high intensities too early, because what you do is you actually hit that ceiling before the body's ready. The adaptation happens and the curve peaks, and then actually when maturation kicks in, the body is finally ready for genuinely high intensity work and you've got nothing left. And that's a mistake that we see like with naturally fast young players. We think because they're fast they can handle more intense speed work. What they are actually doing is only expressing their innate speed ability, which is going to be higher up a genetic profile for them. They're going to be faster than someone else naturally, but it doesn't mean that they need greater intensity to improve. So such an important message to work into your programs, because you don't want to be in the position where you've spent all the currency early when the body isn't ready for it. So if we now look at a senior athlete with a higher training age, low speed age, and years of general fitness work but very little sprint development, they sit way below where they could be on the curve. So they're still going to adapt from this early level of intensity. I've had players in the NFL and international rugby which were using low intensity and generated speed improvement because we graduated it correctly and deliberately based on their speed age. Okay, so we need to be able to classify every exercise in your program by intensity level. And for academy athletes, hold intensity back. So you let the skill exposure and maturation do the work for you. But with senior athletes with low speed ages, you start graduating intensity deliberately and watch the speed age climb. And what's really interesting with this is that it compounds exponentially. So if someone uses a sled sprint at 20% body weight and they improve, the next time they actually use that tool to cement the adaptation, the cost of it becomes greater because they're doing things exponentially faster. So that's why we need to understand intensity, and we can still limit variation by understanding the cost of the exercise. So the right intensity at the right time is what separates development from damage. And that principle applies just as much to how you program across a season as it does to an athlete's career. So the final piece of the frequency puzzle, and the one that catches most coaches out because it requires them to think about speed training completely differently depending on the time of year. Most coaches program speed the same way in pre-season as they do mid-season. Same session, same intensity, same frequency, and the problem with that is that off-season and in-season have completely different jobs. Confuse the two and you either leave development on the table when you had the chance to build it, or break athletes down at exactly the moment you need them to perform. So let me draw this out for you. Here's your off-season loading profile. So volume is going to climb throughout that off-season, okay, and progressively build in intensity to create overload deliberately across the block. This is what's known as your developmental window, okay, where we want to raise and develop pure speed development. This is where you make athletes faster, and this is where you can push the adaptation curve, add volume, increase intensity week on week, and target 1 to 2% speed improvement, which can compound across the year. That's a huge mistake that many coaches make. They can see 20% in strength gains increase, but underestimate the fact that 1 to 2% in a 30-meter sprint time improvement is going to trump everything. So small gains add massive impact. Now, what happens in season? The volume, the total load, it has to decrease because of the nature of performance. So we're going to preserve intensity and manage load, okay, as it's actually going to decline across the season to maximize recovery, and we're going to use the minimum doses that we can do to protect the 1 to 2% that we've already created. The job here isn't to make athletes faster, it's to make sure they arrive at every match as fast as they were at the end of pre-season. So sprint work and sprint development work stays in the program because without it, speed will decay rapidly. But the loading parameters are completely different. Okay, so in off-season, we have a target, 1 to 2% speed improvements through progressive loading, but in season, it's retention. Protect what was built by managing volume and keeping intensity present without pushing adaptation. And most of all, track what's happening in training and games, because you may not even have to do speed loading in order to maintain it, because training and games are going to take care of it too. That is the principle of specificity. So we do have two phases and two completely different jobs, two completely different programming approaches. And once you understand which window you're in, frequency actually becomes really obvious. So let's bring this fully together. How often should your athlete sprint? The answer isn't 2 days a week, it isn't 3, it isn't whatever fits around the rest of your program. It depends on 4 things: the recovery cost of training and where the athlete sits on the speed age scale, how the week is structured with speed as the anchor and everything else built around it, and whether you're working with academy athletes who need intensity held back or senior athletes who need it graduated deliberately, and whether you're in a developmental window for building speed or a retention window to protect it. Get all four right and frequency stops being a guess. Every session has a clear purpose, every recovery window is respected, and every phase of the season is doing exactly the job it's supposed to do. And here's what that means practically. A beginner academy athlete might sprint 4 or 5 times a week at low intensity, learning movement and building exposure, versus a senior athlete who might sprint twice a week at high intensity with 72 hours recovery built in between them. Same sport, different programs, and both of them right. Now, we've covered what speed is, why some athletes are faster, and how to categorize athletes based on speed, age, what physically drives speed improvement, and how often to sprint. The next question is one that divides coaches more than almost any other. Do athletes actually need to lift weights to get faster? The answer might surprise you, so make sure you watch the next video.